two nations under heavy international pressure, two massive government-backed aircraft programs, two countries staking their reputations and billions of dollars on the belief that they could finally shake loose Boeing and Airbus's iron grip on global commercial aviation. That is the real story sitting behind Russia's MC-21 and China's C919, a pair of narrow-body passenger jets that launched with nearly identical timelines, nearly identical national ambitions, and, as the years have proven, nearly identical as first sketched out, and manufacturing bottlenecks that made every promised deadline look optimistic in hindsight. But this is also where the two stories start pulling in different directions. China's C919 is, at this very moment, actually transporting paying passengers on real scheduled routes, slowly, imperfectly, with plenty of problems, still unresolved, but genuinely doing it. Russia's MC-21, meanwhile, has not carried a single paying customer, not one, in nearly 2 decades of development. So is China the automatic winner here? Does this comparison just end there? Not exactly, and understanding why means going much deeper than the surface headline, because these two aircraft are struggling in strikingly similar ways for strikingly similar reasons, even while sitting at genuinely different points on their long journey toward commercial relevance. Start with China, because it has the longer track record of real, tangible results to actually look at. COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, was formally founded in 2008, carrying a very clear national mission: design and manufacture large commercial aircraft inside China and chip away at the country's decades-long reliance on Boeing and Airbus for every single jet its airlines flew. Production work got underway in December 2011. The first prototype rolled out of the factory in November 2015. The maiden flight, originally penciled in for sometime around 2014, didn't actually happen until May 5, 2017, 3 years late out of the gate. Full type certification from China's own aviation regulator, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, finally came through on September 29, 2022, a full 8 years behind the program's original schedule. The first delivery went to China Eastern Airlines that December, and by May 28, 2023, the C919 was finally hauling commercial passengers for the first time, roughly 15 years after COMAC was first established. On paper, that is a genuine, meaningful achievement. An aircraft that was designed, built, certified, and is today actually flying people from city to city. But this is where the story gets considerably messier and considerably more revealing about just how large the gap is between claiming an achievement and actually turning it into an industrial reality at scale. Despite entering commercial service back in 2023, the C919's production ramp-up has been consistently and repeatedly catastrophic, measured against what COMAC itself promised. Going into 2025, the company had set its sights on delivering 75 aircraft across the year, roughly one every 5 days, exactly the kind of pace that would signal the program graduating from a symbolic political milestone into something resembling a genuine commercial operation. That target did not survive contact with reality for long. By September 2025, Bloomberg was reporting that COMAC had quietly slashed the goal down to just 25 aircraft. And even that dramatically reduced number turned out to be wildly over-optimistic. Regulatory filings from China's 3 major state-owned carriers, China Eastern, Air China, and China Southern, showed that by September, only 5 aircraft had actually been delivered against an expected 32 for that point in the year. The final count for all of 2025 landed somewhere between 15 and 16 aircraft, essentially identical to what 2024 had produced, which meant an entire calendar year had passed without any real acceleration in manufacturing output, despite 2 full years of supposedly ramping up. The opening months of 2026 didn't offer any reason for optimism either. Data from Air Data News showed 0 C919 deliveries in January, 1 in February, 2 in March, 2 in April, just 5 aircraft across the first 4 months of the new year. A pace that, if it continued unchanged through December, would produce somewhere around 15 total for the year, essentially flat against the previous 2 years. Since entering commercial service in 2023, the C919 had accumulated just 37 total deliveries by spring 2026, split among China Eastern with 15, Air China with 11, China Southern with 10, and a single demonstration aircraft still sitting with COMAC itself. Industry watchers pointed to the same familiar collection of culprits each time this came up. The aircraft still relies heavily on Western suppliers for its most critical systems, and most critically of all, on CFM's LEAP 1C engines, produced through the joint venture between GE Aerospace and France's Safran, a dependency that turned genuinely alarming in summer 2025 when the United States temporarily halted engine exports to China amid spiking trade tensions before eventually lifting the restriction. On top of that, reporting from the South China Morning Post specifically flagged persistent labor shortages and the sheer underlying complexity of assembling a modern commercial airliner as continuing bottlenecks inside the production system, with some fully completed airframes reportedly sitting finished on the factory floor, waiting on engines that simply hadn't shown up yet. The order book tells its own complicated story about how far the C919 actually sits from genuine international commercial viability. COMAC entered 2026 carrying a backlog of over 1,000 aircraft across its entire product lineup, a number that sounds genuinely impressive taken at face value. But look more carefully, and things get considerably less encouraging for anyone hoping the jet might soon be competing head-to-head with Boeing and Airbus across the open global aviation market. Independent analysis from Liam News calculated that this 1,000-plus backlog translated into roughly just 7% of the entire global single-aisle backlog in the 125 to 240 seat category. And critically, virtually every single one of those orders came from Chinese state-owned airlines and leasing firms operating under what amounts to direct government direction, rather than from independent airlines around the world freely choosing between COMAC, Boeing, and Airbus based on price and performance. As of early 2026, not a single C919 had been delivered outside mainland China, with the only international orders on the books coming from carriers in Brunei and Cambodia, both countries with close political ties to Beijing, rather than genuinely independent commercial relationships. The jet also still lacks certification from either the American FAA or the European EASA, and without those two approvals, the vast majority of the world's airlines outside China's immediate political orbit simply cannot legally operate it, regardless of how many units eventually roll off the production line. Before crossing over to Russia's side of this story, it's worth pausing to look at how these two aircraft actually compare on paper, because the engineering thinking behind each reveals a lot about their very different design philosophies. The C919 seats between 158 and 192 passengers depending on cabin layout, with a range of roughly 4,075 to 5,155 kilometers, placing it in fairly direct competition with the Boeing 737 MAX 8 and the Airbus A320neo. Russia's primary MC-21 variant, the MC-21-310, carries a broadly similar passenger count, but Russian engineers specifically designed and marketed the jet around a genuinely wider fuselage than either the 737 or the C919, a real, credible engineering distinction, because a wider cabin translates into more comfortable seating and broader aisles without sacrificing overall capacity. On pure technical merit, that wider fuselage gives the MC-21 a meaningful advantage in passenger experience that could eventually help it compete even against Boeing and Airbus jets on that specific dimension, assuming it ever actually reaches airlines. But a technically superior fuselage is worth absolutely nothing to an airline that cannot take delivery of the aircraft, and that yawning gap between genuine engineering merit sitting idle behind an unfinished certification process defines the MC-21 situation in mid-2026 far more than any design choice ever could. Russia's MC-21 has technically been in development for roughly as long as the C919, but sits at a dramatically earlier stage of actual commercial existence. The program launched in 2007 under what was then Irkut Corporation, later absorbed into the state-controlled United Aircraft Corporation under the broader Rostec industrial conglomerate, with the explicit goal of producing a genuine domestic rival to the 737 and the A320. The original design leaned heavily on international components, most centrally a pair of Pratt & Whitney PW1400G engines, along with Western-sourced composite materials and avionics systems throughout the aircraft. The MC-21's maiden flight took place on May 28, 2017, almost the exact same month and year the C919 hit that same milestone, and for a stretch of time, it genuinely looked like Russia might actually pull this thing off and deliver something competitive. Then Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, triggering sweeping international sanctions, and everything about the MC-21 program changed in an instant. Rostec lost access to its Pratt & Whitney engines overnight. It lost its Western composite materials. It lost its Western avionics. Essentially, the entire international supply chain that the aircraft had been designed around vanished in a matter of weeks. And rather than abandoning the program entirely, Russian government leadership committed to rebuilding the whole aircraft from scratch using purely domestic Russian components, a process officials labeled import substitution. The new centerpiece of that rebuilt aircraft became the Aviavigatel PD-14, a homegrown turbofan engine manufactured by Perm Engine Company, replacing the Pratt & Whitney power plants the original design had been built around. What followed was one of the most sustained and publicly embarrassing streaks of broken promises in modern aviation history. Serial production, originally targeted For 2016 slipped to 2019, then 2020, then 2022, then 2024. By May 2026, Rostec's chief executive Sergei Chemezov was forced to acknowledge that certification and initial aircraft deliveries were slipping yet again, now pushed back to 2027, a full 11 years past the program's original production target, with United Aircraft still theoretically aiming to reach an annual output of 36 aircraft somewhere around 2030. Line these two programs up side by side as of mid-2026, and the gap is stark and undeniable. The C919, whatever its ongoing production struggles, has been carrying revenue passengers since May 2023, has accumulated 37 total deliveries, and operates across an expanding domestic route network that has recently extended into Hong Kong. The MC-21, by contrast, had not delivered a single production aircraft to any airline anywhere in the world as of mid-2026. In late May and early June of that year, United Aircraft moved what it described as the first fully domestically built, fully import-substituted MC-21-310 off the Irkutsk assembly line and over to the flight test division, a milestone that sounds significant on the surface until you understand. It simply meant the aircraft could now begin the certification testing process with no paying passenger anywhere close to stepping aboard. By July 2026, Russia's aviation regulator, Rosaviatsia, assessed the overall certification effort at roughly 45% complete, with Yakovlev's chief designer indicating that flight testing remained on track to conclude around June 2027, assuming nothing else went wrong in the meantime. Put plainly, while the C919 has already crossed what is unquestionably the single hardest barrier in commercial aviation, achieving full domestic type certification and launching genuine revenue passenger service, the MC-21 remains stuck on the wrong side of that same threshold, still grinding through certification testing nearly a decade past its original schedule for completing it. Despite sitting at genuinely different stages of development, both programs share a remarkably consistent set of underlying weaknesses. And understanding those shared vulnerabilities explains an enormous amount about just how difficult it actually is to build a globally competitive commercial airliner from scratch while operating under sustained geopolitical pressure. Both aircraft are built around a single critical vulnerability in their engine supply chains. The C919 remains dependent on CFM's LEAP 1C engines, a dependency that leaves the entire program directly exposed to American export control decisions that can halt deliveries with essentially no warning. As already demonstrated in 2025, the MC-21's domestic PD-14 engine technically sidesteps that specific vulnerability, but exchanges it for a different one, a manufacturing base that simply cannot produce engines fast enough to support any meaningful production ramp, with Perm Engine Company completing only 7 PD-14 engines across all of 2025, against an original target of 24. A shortfall severe enough on its own to make any real MC-21 production acceleration essentially impossible, regardless of how smoothly the certification process proceeds from here. Both programs have also repeatedly publicly slashed their own delivery forecasts, sometimes by 2/3 or more within a single year, a pattern of chronic and spectacular overpromising that has steadily eroded outside analyst confidence in either company's stated roadmaps. And both remain almost entirely dependent on captive, government-directed domestic orders rather than genuine competitive wins against Boeing and Airbus on the open international market, with the C919's order backlog concentrated overwhelmingly among Chinese state airlines, and the MC-21's confirmed orders sitting almost exclusively with Russia's state-controlled Aeroflot group. Where the two programs genuinely and importantly diverge is in the fundamental industrial base each country actually has behind it, and this is precisely where China's head start becomes most visible. China's aerospace and broader manufacturing supply chain, even accounting for its continued reliance on Western engines and avionics for this specific aircraft, exists inside an economy with vastly larger overall industrial capacity, a considerably deeper pool of trained aerospace engineering talent, and critically, an economy that hasn't been operating under the same sweeping, wartime-level sanctions Russia has faced continuously since February 2022. Russia's MC-21 program isn't just wrestling with the ordinary supply chain complexity that every new aircraft program encounters. It is attempting something considerably more radical, rebuilding an entire aircraft's core systems, its engines, its composites, its avionics, its hydraulics, essentially from the ground up using a domestic supplier base that in several cases had to construct entire new manufacturing capabilities from nothing. Capabilities that China's supply chain, however dependent on Western parts for this particular jet, never needed to build from scratch. China chose to rely on Western engines because it was commercially efficient and technically advantageous at the time. Russia was forced to abandon Western engines entirely because international sanctions left it with no other option. and that forced wartime pivot has proven dramatically costlier and dramatically slower than China's calculated dependency, even though China's own approach still carries a real long-term strategic risk, given how clearly Washington has already shown it can disrupt that exact supply chain whenever it decides to. Both nations also carry very different historical baggage into this challenge, and that history shapes how each government and each domestic aviation industry approaches the task of building a competitive commercial aircraft from nothing. The Soviet Union operated a fully self-contained commercial aviation industry for decades during the Cold War, producing aircraft like the Tupolev Tu-154 and the Ilyushin Il-86 that served the entire Eastern Bloc without requiring a single Western component, an entire generational tradition of self-sufficient aerospace manufacturing that largely collapsed amid the economic devastation that followed the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, as Russian carriers increasingly turned to cheaper and more reliable Boeing and Airbus jets throughout the 90s and 2000s. The MC-21 program represented, in many ways, an attempt to reclaim that lost independence, though ironically, its original 2007 design path toward genuine global competitiveness required leaning more heavily on Western components than any Soviet-era airliner ever had, a strategic calculation that made the aircraft credible on the world stage right up until the exact moment the 2022 sanctions transformed that same Western dependence into an existential program-wide threat. China, by contrast, never had anything remotely resembling a comparable independent commercial aviation tradition to draw on or reclaim. The C919 represents China's first genuine attempt at designing and building a large, internationally credible commercial passenger jet from a standing start, without the kind of decades-old domestic aerospace engineering culture that Russia, whatever its current industrial struggles, could at least in theory draw institutional memory and technical talent from. That difference cuts in genuinely complicated directions for each program. Russia has proven engineering knowledge buried somewhere in its institutional memory, but that knowledge is scattered across a manufacturing base that atrophied badly across 3 post-Soviet decades. China lacks that historical foundation entirely, but has built its entire modern aerospace effort on top of a vastly larger, more modern, and more rapidly expanding industrial base than Russia's aerospace sector currently has access to. Both countries' aviation ambitions also stretch well beyond these single narrow-body programs, and comparing their follow-on plans offers another useful window into which nations' broader aerospace strategy actually looks more likely to achieve real scale over time. China's COMAC has already secured an avionics partnership with Aviation Systems, a joint venture between GE Aerospace and China's own aviation industry corporation, for its next major program, the C929 wide-body jet, along with a launch order from Air China, with a maiden flight targeted around 2030 and entry into commercial service projected near 2035. Preliminary design work has reportedly even begun on a still larger, longer-range aircraft tentatively called the C939, positioned to eventually challenge the Boeing 777 and Airbus A350 somewhere further down the road. Russia's own wide-body ambitions, meanwhile, trace back to a program that was originally a joint venture with China itself before that partnership fell apart, following the 2022 Ukraine invasion, leaving Russia to periodically float renewed wide-body cooperation proposals to India instead, discussions that have not produced any concrete commitments whatsoever. That particular detail deserves to be sat with carefully because it means China's next-generation wide-body program has already secured a real launch customer and a functioning international industrial partnership, while Russia's comparable long-range ambitions remain stuck at the level of informal diplomatic conversation with a country that already walked away from a similar aircraft partnership with Russia once before, even accounting for genuine skepticism about whether COMAC's optimistic C929 and C939 timelines will hold up any better than its C919 targets have. China's aviation industry is visibly building outward from its narrow-body program toward more ambitious follow-on aircraft. In a way, Russia's sector, still entirely consumed by simply finishing the MC-21's own certification, hasn't been able to meaningfully replicate. The market reality both programs are ultimately running up against also deserves honest attention, because neither the C919 nor the MC-21 is actually positioned to dethrone Boeing and Airbus in any near-term realistic scenario. Both Western manufacturers combined roll out dozens of narrow-body aircraft every single month, backed by decades of accumulated production experience, globally proven safety and reliability records, and full certification from every major aviation regulator on Earth, allowing their aircraft to operate for essentially any airline anywhere in the world without restriction. Neither the C919 nor the MC-21 currently holds FAA or ASA certification, which means neither aircraft can legally operate for the overwhelming majority of the world's airlines outside their own domestic markets and closest political allies, regardless of how many units either company eventually manages to physically manufacture. That reality places a very hard ceiling on what either program can realistically accomplish in the near to medium term, essentially locking both jets into dominating captive, domestic, and politically aligned markets, while remaining effectively shut out of the broader global commercial aviation market that Boeing and Airbus still overwhelmingly control. So, which one actually has the better future when it comes to eventually challenging the West? Judged honestly against where each program genuinely stands right now, the C919 holds a real, meaningful, if still fragile lead, specifically because it has already crossed the single hardest threshold either aircraft needs to clear: full domestic type certification and actual revenue passenger service, a milestone the MC-21 is not expected to reach until 2027 at the very earliest, and probably later, given the program's own consistent track record of missed deadlines. The C919's production ramp-up has genuinely been disappointing, repeatedly falling well short of what COMAC itself promised, and its near total dependence on Western engines remains a live, unresolved vulnerability that could resurface the moment trade tensions between Washington and Beijing flare up again. But a disappointing production ramp from an aircraft that is at least flying, certified, and carrying real passengers still represents meaningfully more actual progress than an aircraft that, as of mid-2026, hasn't even completed certification testing yet. That said, treating this as a clean two-horse race with a comfortable, settled winner would be a mistake that oversimplifies how much genuine uncertainty still surrounds both programs' longer-term paths. If the United States decides to permanently, rather than just temporarily, cut off CFM engine supplies to COMAC the next time trade tensions escalate seriously, the C919's entire production line could grind to a halt nearly overnight, regardless of how many otherwise complete airframes are sitting on the factory floor waiting for power plants that never arrive. Flip the scenario around, and if Russia's PD-14 engine program finally breaks through its stubborn manufacturing bottlenecks, and if the MC-21's remaining certification hurdles prove less intractable than the program's recent history would suggest, Rostec could theoretically compress years of remaining development work into a shorter window than currently looks realistic, particularly if the war in Ukraine reaches some form of resolution that eases the pressure bearing down on Russia's broader industrial base. Neither of those outcomes represents anything like a current baseline expectation, but both remain genuinely possible, and both underline just how contingent this entire comparison is on factors well beyond pure engineering capability, on geopolitics, on sanctions regimes, and on the unpredictable diplomatic relationships between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow that neither COMAC nor Rostec actually controls. If the real question is which program is more likely to eventually reach genuine industrial scale, producing tens of aircraft per year and pushing meaningfully past a purely captive domestic market, the C919 simply has more real runway already behind it, more operational experience already banked, and a considerably larger overall industrial and economic base supporting it, even while both programs share exactly the same fundamental long-term weakness, remaining almost entirely dependent on their own government's willingness to keep directing captive orders their way, rather than genuinely winning business on the open international market against two manufacturers that have spent more than half a century perfecting precisely what both COMAC and Rostec are, even now, still only beginning to figure out. There is one more angle worth sitting with before closing out this comparison, and it has less to do with engineering specs and more to do with something harder to quantify: sheer institutional patience. Both China and Russia are, at their core, running long multi-decade national experiments, testing whether government-directed industrial policy can eventually manufacture its way into a market that Boeing and Airbus have owned for 2 full generations. Neither government shows any sign of walking away from that experiment, regardless of how many delivery targets get missed, how many certification deadlines slip, or how much money disappears into the gap between promise and reality. China has already demonstrated its willingness to absorb losses and setbacks on the C919 for however long it takes, made visible by its simultaneous investment in the far more ambitious C929 and C939 follow-on programs, even while the narrow-body jet continues struggling to hit basic annual production numbers. Russia, despite operating under a vastly more constrained economic and industrial environment thanks to the Ukraine war and the cascade of sanctions that followed it, has shown that same stubborn, grinding persistence with the MC-21, repeatedly revising deadlines rather than scrapping the program outright, treating aerospace self-sufficiency as a matter of genuine strategic survival rather than a discretionary prestige project that could simply be shelved if the financial math stopped working out. That shared, unshakable commitment to seeing both programs through regardless of cost or delay is ultimately the single most important detail for anyone trying to realistically forecast where either aircraft actually ends up a decade from now. Neither Beijing nor Moscow is approaching these programs as short-term commercial investments subject to ordinary market discipline and rational exit strategies. Both are treating them as long-term strategic national assets, worth sustaining through years of humiliating delays and drastically revised targets precisely because the alternative, permanent dependency on Boeing and Airbus for an entire nation's commercial aviation needs, has become politically and strategically unacceptable to both governments, regardless of the price attached to fixing it. Given that shared, open-ended, multi-decade horizon, the current gap between the C-919's real but imperfect commercial operation and the MC-21's still unfinished certification process may ultimately matter less than it appears to from where we stand today. What both governments are actually betting on isn't winning a comparison in 2026. It's still being in the game, however slowly, however expensively, whenever Boeing and Airbus's own seemingly unshakable duopoly finally starts showing real structural cracks of its own. And given the trajectory of global aviation, the trade tensions reshaping supply chains, and the sheer weight of national ambition sitting behind both programs, that moment may come sooner than the current market leaders would like to admit.